September 14th, 1944. Near the Belgian town of Charleroi, 5 German tankers stared through their periscopes at a massive American Sherman tank rolling toward them across an open field, and they began to laugh. It was thick, confident laughter born from years of armoured superiority, the kind of laughter that comes before catastrophe. What they didn't know was that the very tank they were mocking would become the last thing they ever saw. The war had changed for Hauptsturmführer Klaus Bergmann in ways that no amount of training could have prepared him for. By September 1944, the commander of the 1st Panzer Company of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps knew one thing with absolute certainty. The Americans made inferior tanks. This wasn't arrogance speaking, it was doctrine. It was history. It was every engagement they'd fought since the invasion of Normandy 3 months earlier. Klaus sat in the commander's cupola of his Tiger I, designation Falke, the Hawk parked in a concealed position, overlooking the Meuse River Valley. At 32 years old, he carried himself with the weight of a man who had seen armoured warfare evolve from cavalry charges to mechanized ballet. He had fought in Russia, where he'd learned that German steel was superior to Soviet quantity. He had fought in Normandy, where he'd discovered that American production meant nothing against German engineering. A Panther could outgun a Sherman from kilometers away. A Tiger could shrug off most American anti-tank fire as if it were harassment from children with pebbles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The landscape around him was transitioning from the bocage of Normandy, those brutal hedgerows that had chewed up German mobility, into more open terrain. Here, in Belgium, with the Germans slowly pulling back after their failed attempt to hold the line, the terrain was beginning to work in their favour again. Open ground. The kind of ground where tanks could manoeuvre. The kind of ground where a skilled panzer commander with superior armour and firepower could turn the tide of an engagement before the enemy even understood what was happening. Klaus had 5 tanks under his command that morning. His own Tiger I, fitted with the legendary 88mm KGK-36 cannon, 2 Panther tanks, Ausführung A models, each carrying the high-velocity 75mm gun, and 2 Panzer IVs, the older reliable workhorses of the German army, armed with 75mm guns of their own. Combined, they represented what Klaus considered the finest tank force in the world. Their crews had been together for 8 months. They understood each other without speaking. They moved like a single organism, coordinated and lethal. The problem was that the war was ending, and Klaus knew it. Not in a defeatist sense that would have brought the Gestapo to his door, but in a realistic sense that a professional soldier understood. The endless American supply lines. The Soviet juggernaut pressing from the east. The RAF and USAAF maintaining air superiority that meant German forces could only move at night. Resources were thinning. Fuel was rationed. The Grand Armour tactics of 1941 and 1942 were becoming impossible when you couldn't move your tanks more than a few kilometers without risk of running dry. Still, Klaus had his company, and as long as he had his tanks, he had authority. As long as he had authority, he had purpose. And right now, his purpose was to hold this position overlooking the river valley and report any American movements to divisional command. That's when the runner came. The report crackled through the radio in Oberscharführer Hans Müller's voice. Hans was Klaus's gunner and had been with him since 1942. They'd fought together through countless engagements, and Klaus trusted his eyes as much as he trusted his own. Hans had the kind of vision that could spot a camouflaged position at 1,000 meters. He could identify American tank types by their silhouettes alone. Commander, movement at 2 o'clock, 1 kilometer, American armor. Klaus straightened in the cupola, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. The morning light was crisp and clear, ideal conditions for gunnery. The open field stretched before them, grass and scattered brush, no cover for armor. Perfect. How many? Klaus asked into the radio. Single tank, large configuration. Appears to be a heavy type. Moving slowly. No support visible. Klaus lowered his binoculars and studied the shape more carefully. His first reaction was confusion. The American heavy tank, the one they'd been hearing rumors about for weeks, was supposed to be a rarity, a limited production vehicle that barely existed. Yet there it was, rolling across the open field like a steel mountain, its massive hull catching the morning light. It was the M4A3E2 Jumbo, 51 tons of armor and armament, a tank that the Americans had built in such small numbers that Klaus had seen more unicorns than jumbos in his operational intelligence briefings. "What is that thing?" muttered one of Klaus's crew through the internal communication system. It was Otto, the loader, a young man from Stuttgart who had a habit of verbalizing every observation. Klaus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his own binoculars and studied the approaching tank more carefully. The armor profile was unusual, the hull was noticeably thicker than a standard Sherman, and the way the turret sat suggested additional plating. But Klaus had fought American tanks before. He'd destroyed American tanks before. The Sherman, in all its variations, was a fundamentally inferior platform to German design. "It's still just a Sherman," Klaus said finally, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from experience. "A fat one, perhaps, but still just a Sherman. It's probably making up for poor gun performance with extra armor. All the more reason it will die easier." The statement hung in the radio silence for a moment. Klaus heard it, then laughter. Not mocking, just the natural reaction of seasoned soldiers to their commander's confidence. Otto laughed. Hans laughed. The radio operator laughed. Even Klaus felt the corner of his mouth twitch with something that might become a smile. The Jumbo continued its slow, methodical approach across the open field. Klaus watched it move and made calculations. The tank was moving at roughly 10 kilometers per hour, which meant it was being cautious. That suggested the American commander inside whoever he was suspected German armor in the area. Smart, but ultimately irrelevant. The American had already revealed himself. Klaus held the advantage of position, superior firepower, and the element of tactical surprise. Klaus made his decision. "All stations. This is Falke Actual. Hold position. Do not fire until I give the command. I want to determine the effective armor thickness at maximum range. This will be valuable intelligence." The tactical reasoning was sound. Understanding how the enemy's new heavy tank performed under fire would help German command plan anti-tank strategies. But Klaus knew, in the part of his mind that dealt in operational truth, that there was another reason. He wanted to see if the Americans had finally built a tank that could stand up to German armor. He wanted to test it. He wanted to understand the limits of this new American experiment. "Target distance approximately 1,200 meters, Hans reported. "Steady approach. No signs of recognition or evasive maneuvers." "Range 1,200, Klaus repeated to himself. At that distance, his 88mm cannon could penetrate almost any armor in the world. The Panther's 75mm gun was optimized for around 800 meters. Even the Panzer IV's 75mm short gun would be effective at this range against most armor configurations. Klaus made a key decision that would define everything that followed. Falke 2 and 3, flank left. I want to establish a crossfire. Falke 4 and 5, hold position and provide covering fire if needed. Falke Actual will maintain primary firing position. This was textbook Panzer tactics. The German armoured doctrine called for coordinated attacks, flanking movements, crossfire. Never commit all your armour to a frontal assault when manoeuvring could create superior positioning. Klaus was following doctrine written by the masterminds of Blitzkrieg, refined through 3 years of experience. The two Panther tanks began to move, sliding left across the rolling terrain, attempting to position themselves so that they could strike the American heavy tank from the flank, where armor was thinner, where a 75mm gun would have a legitimate chance of penetration. Klaus watched the Jumbo continue its advance. The moment reached that perfect threshold where analysis became action. Klaus made the call. Target identified. Prepare to engage on my command. Hans. I want a round in the chamber, high explosive initially. I want to see how this thing reacts to incoming fire. High explosive round loaded. Hans confirmed. Klaus was thinking like a scientist now, not a soldier. What does the enemy tank do when it comes under fire? Does it accelerate? Does it return fire immediately? Does it maneuver? The answer would tell him much about the American commander's experience and the tank's mobility. The jumbo was now at approximately 900 meters. The range was perfect for Klaus's 88mm gun. The afternoon light was ideal. The American tank maintained its steady pace, moving across the open field, completely exposed. Falke Actual has target acquired. Klaus radioed. All stations, stand by for primary engagement. Klaus leaned down into the tank, his eye finding the sight picture that Hans had prepared. The jumbo filled the reticle perfectly, a massive target, slow-moving, predictable. Klaus could see the American tank's turret, the thick hull, the slight lean of the suspension as it navigated gentle terrain. He had destroyed 53 enemy tanks before this moment. American Shermans, Soviet T-34 seconds, even a heavy Joseph Stalin tank in Russia. Each one had taught him something about the nature of armoured warfare. Each one had confirmed his understanding. Superior German design and doctrine would always prevail over American production and American tactics. Klaus took a breath. "Fire!" he commanded. Hans squeezed the trigger of the 88mm gun. The cannon roared. The entire Tiger shuddered with recoil. The 88mm round, travelling at more than 790 meters per second, made the journey across the open field in less than a second and a half. Klaus watched for the impact through the smoke. What he saw next changed everything. The 88mm round struck the jumbo's hull and ricocheted. For a moment, Klaus couldn't process what he was seeing. In his experience, an 88mm armour-piercing round at this range and angle simply did not ricochet off American armour. The round had hit the sloped front hull plate at an angle that should have either penetrated or at least deflected downward into the ground. Instead, it had deflected upward into the sky, a bright streak of tracer that painted its rejection in red fire. "Reload," Klaus heard himself saying, though his voice sounded distant, as if someone else was speaking through his mouth. Load now. But in that moment of reloading, something shifted in Klaus's understanding. The jumbo accelerated. The American tank commander had been waiting for this. The heavy Sherman suddenly surged forward, its diesel engine roaring to life, and it began to maneuver. But it didn't retreat. That would have been the intelligent response. Instead, it turned toward the German position. It was advancing directly at Klaus's Tiger. "The American is attacking," Otto reported, his voice higher than before, excitement and something else apprehension colouring every word. "It's coming toward us. It's actually coming toward us." Klaus had fought enough battles to understand what he was witnessing. The American commander had recognized the shot, understood that he was being engaged, and made a decision. Not to run, not to hide, but to close distance. Because at close range, the massive armour of the jumbo would become the dominant factor in the engagement. "Keep the range open," Klaus commanded. "Maintain distance. Hans, armour-piercing loaded?" "Ready," Hans reported. The jumbo was now at 800 meters and closing. The American was moving at a steady pace, not recklessly fast, but deliberately, methodically advancing across the open field. It was the kind of movement that spoke of confidence, or perhaps ignorance. Klaus had learned that American tankers were rarely as well trained as German crews, but occasionally one would demonstrate battlefield cunning. Secondary targets, maintain position. Do not engage until primary target has been neutralized. All stations acknowledge. The acknowledgements came back. The Panther tanks held their flanking position. The Panzer IVs remained in supporting positions. Klaus had maneuvered his force perfectly, or so he believed, and now the American tank was walking into the carefully prepared engagement. Distance 700 meters, Hans announced. Steady approach. Solution ready. Klaus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hold fire, he commanded. Let him come closer. I want to see what this armor is made of. Full penetration. Point-blank range. I want to fire into that turret at less than 300 meters and watch this tank die in front of us. It was not a sound tactical decision. It was the decision of a man intoxicated by confidence, by historical superiority, by the certainty that came from 3 years of armoured dominance. Klaus wanted more than victory. He wanted proof. He wanted to demonstrate to his crews, to himself, that German armour and German gunnery could prevail against whatever the Americans could field. The jumbo continued its approach. 700 meters became 600 meters, became 500 meters. The American tank moved with methodical determination across the open field. Klaus had his 88mm gun tracking the target. Hans maintained the solution. Otto stood ready to load the next round. Klaus's radio operator maintained communication with the supporting tanks. Everything was prepared. Everything was perfect. Everything was about to go catastrophically wrong. Distance 400 meters, Hans reported. The American shows no signs of slowing, no return fire yet, no deviation in course. Klaus understood what was happening. The American commander was racing toward engagement because at close range, the jumbo's massive armor advantage would become overwhelming. It was the right tactical decision for the American. It was the wrong decision for Klaus to allow it. But Klaus was no longer making rational tactical decisions. Klaus was testing his hypothesis. Klaus was proving a point. Distance 300 meters. Fire at will, Klaus commanded. When you have a clean shot, take it. Hans didn't fire. Klaus's order had been for Hans to take the shot when he had a clean solution. But the jumbo's steady advance toward them was now presenting an increasingly difficult geometry. The tank's angle was changing as it closed the distance. The optimal targeting solution kept shifting. 200 meters, Hans announced. Geometry is degrading. Should I take the shot now? Negative, Klaus said. I want point blank. I want turret. I want clean penetration. The jumbo was now so close that Klaus could see details through his cupola periscope. The American tank's turret was swinging slightly, adjusting its aim as the distance closed. The main gun was pointing directly at the Tiger. Klaus felt the first small tremor of concern. 150 meters. Klaus, the American is preparing to fire. Solution is optimal. Firing now. Hans squeezed the trigger. The 88mm armor-piercing round at this range was a hypervelocity missile. The shell departed the gun at 790 meters per second and covered the 150-meter distance to the jumbo in slightly more than 1/10 of a second. Klaus watched the trajectory and waited for the impact that would end this engagement. What he saw would spend the rest of his days replaying in his mind. The 88mm round struck the jumbo's turret directly and deflected. The armor-piercing round, one of the most lethal anti-tank projectiles in existence, one that had penetrated Soviet heavy armor and American medium armor with equal brutality, struck the sloped armor of the jumbo's turret and was deflected away like a stone off water. The round rose skyward, a flash of light and explosive energy, and Klaus felt the moment when his certainty fractured. In the same instant, Klaus heard the sound that all tankers fear, the distinct deep crack of a 76mm gun. The American had fired. Klaus never saw the round leave, the jumbo's gun. In his later memories of this moment, and there would be many, he would describe it as feeling rather than seeing, a shattering impact. A sound so loud it seemed to come from inside his own skull. The Tiger lurched on its suspension. "We're hit!" Otto screamed. The front hull. The 76mm round had penetrated the Tiger's front plate, a feat that most American tanks couldn't accomplish. Klaus felt the tank shudder with the impact of the projectile inside, felt the sudden temperature spike in the compartment, felt the smell of burning. But worse than the physical damage was the psychological impact. In a single exchange of fire, Klaus's entire understanding of armoured warfare had been upended. "Return fire," he commanded, but his voice sounded uncertain now, infected with something he had never felt in a tank before. Doubt. Hans was already working, loading another round, trying to regain the solution on the advancing jumbo. But the American tank was accelerating, again, pressing its advantage, and Klaus suddenly understood the American commander's strategy. The jumbo wasn't trying to stay at distance. The jumbo didn't care about long-range gun duels. The jumbo had been designed for one simple purpose: to break through German anti-tank defences by absorbing damage and delivering superior firepower in close quarters. Klaus had walked directly into the exact engagement scenario that the jumbo had been designed to exploit. All stations, engage the primary target. Klaus radioed desperately. All guns, fire now, fire now. The Panthers opened fire from the flank. The Panzer IVs added their 75mm guns. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the open field in a display of German firepower that should have destroyed the American tank instantly. The jumbo's armour deflected nearly everything, and as Klaus watched, as he ordered his crews to continue firing, as the American tank manoeuvred closer, he understood, with a clarity born of combat, that the nature of the war had fundamentally changed. The era of German armoured superiority was ending, not with a slow decline, but with a thunderous rejection. The American tank had proved that American engineering, American production, and American tactics could stand equal to German excellence, and Klaus Bergmann, commander of the 1st Panzer Company, was about to pay the price for not believing it sooner. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The world inside the Tiger I became a chamber of chaos and noise. Alarms screamed. Smoke filled the compartment. Klaus heard Otto shouting something unintelligible above the roar of the diesel engine straining under emergency power. The tank lurched violently to the right as the driver desperately tried to maneuver away from the American position, the tracks churning frantically through the grass and soil. Klaus had perhaps 3 seconds to understand. What was happening before his training, his instincts, and his natural survival mechanism overrode whatever remained of his shattered confidence. Emergency protocols! Klaus roared into the radio, his voice cutting through the internal commotion with the authority of a man who had survived by reacting faster than thinking. All stations, execute evasive maneuver Gamma. The jumbo has armour we cannot penetrate at this range. Fall back to secondary positions near the tree line. Move now! The Tiger's engine screamed as the driver pushed the accelerator to its limit. Klaus gripped the edge of the cupola, his knuckles white. As another round whistled past them, the American had fired again, but the German tank's sudden acceleration had thrown off the targeting solution. The 76mm round passed so close Klaus could hear its passage, a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. In that moment, sheltering behind the steel of the Tiger's hull, Klaus made a calculation that would define everything that followed. The jumbo had already scored a penetrating hit on his tank. The American commander was good, truly good, the kind of opponent Klaus had rarely faced. The jumbo's armour had proven immune to the very weapons Klaus had considered invincible. There was only one rational response to this situation. All tanks, disengage immediately, Klaus ordered, his voice steady now, all fear compartmentalized into a locked room in his mind where it could be dealt with later. We cannot penetrate this target with current ammunition loadouts. Recommend armor-piercing ammunition with maximum muzzle velocity. Recommend range advantage re-established. This engagement is concluded. It was a tactical retreat dressed in professional language, but Klaus knew what it truly was, the moment when the old certainties died. The German tanks began their retreat toward the tree line, moving in coordinated bounds, one tank covering while others moved, then reversing the process. Practiced dance that had kept German armour alive through 1,000 engagements. The 2 Panther tanks swung wide, their guns still tracking the advancing jumbo, but making no more attempts to stop it. The Panzer IVs provided covering fire as they withdrew, their older 75mm guns completely ineffective against the American heavy tank's armor profile. Klaus watched from the Tiger's cupola as the jumbo slowed its advance, not pursuing but methodically continuing forward, as if confident that time and position favored the American cause. It was a tank commander's gesture of supreme confidence, and Klaus recognized it as such. The American knew that he had won this engagement. The American knew that the German commander had lost. What Klaus didn't know, what he would only learn later, much later, through intelligence briefings and combat analysis, was that the M4A3E2 jumbo had been specifically designed for this exact moment in the war. American engineers, understanding that German armor had dominated every engagement since 1941, had asked a simple question. What if we built a tank that was essentially immune to anti-tank guns? What if we concentrated so much armor around the vital areas that existing German weapons simply could not reliably penetrate it? The answer was the jumbo, a tank so heavily armored that it sacrificed speed and fuel economy. A tank that carried less ammunition because every cubic centimeter not devoted to armor was a waste of resources. A tank that was, in essence, a fortress on tracks, slow, methodical, unstoppable. Klaus and his crews retreated into the forest north of Charleroi, and there they waited through the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening. Klaus established a new position with fields of fire toward the valley where the jumbo had emerged. He ordered ammunition resupply from division. He filed a detailed combat report that would eventually make its way through German command channels to the strategic command staff. But, mostly, Klaus sat in the commander's cupola of his Tiger and thought about what he had witnessed. The 88mm gun, the gun that had terrorized Soviet armor, the gun that had defined German armored superiority since 1941, had been rendered partially ineffective, not completely. Klaus understood that at different angles, at different ranges, the gun would still penetrate the jumbo's armor. But the jumbo was no longer something that could be instantly destroyed by the mere presence of a German heavy tank. The jumbo was something that had to be carefully engaged, flanked, or engaged by multiple tanks simultaneously. This realization extended beyond the jumbo. If the Americans had built one such tank, they would build more. And if they could build tanks that shrugged off German anti-tank fire, what did that mean for the entire German armored doctrine? What did it mean for the war? The next morning, divisional staff arrived not to congratulate Klaus on holding position, but to interrogate him about the engagement. A Major Richter from the intelligence section, a man with the analytical eyes of someone who had spent the war processing combat reports into strategic assessments, sat across from Klaus in the makeshift command post, a small wooden shed several kilometers from the actual tank positions. The armor deflected your 88mm round? Richter asked, his pen poised over a leather notebook, his skepticism evident. Twice, Klaus replied, his voice level. The first round, at approximately 1,200 meters, struck the hull at an angled trajectory and ricocheted upward. The second round, at approximately 150 meters, struck the turret and was similarly deflected. And the round that struck your Tiger? 76mm, I believe. Armor-piercing. Penetrated the front hull plate. My crew managed to extricate the tank from the engagement area before additional hits could be scored. Richter made notes, then looked up, his eyes searching Klaus's face for something. A lie, perhaps. A weakness. A commander making excuses for failure. The designation of this tank, Richter said slowly, is M4A3E2, which we have designated as the Jumbo in our intelligence reports. We have estimated that approximately 50 to 100 of these vehicles have been produced. We believed their actual deployment would be minimal. You are suggesting that their armor is substantially thicker than reported. I am not suggesting, Klaus said, and there was something in his voice now that made Richter pause. Not anger, not defensiveness, something closer to acceptance of an unpleasant truth. I am reporting that our current ammunition, at engagement ranges that have proven effective against all other American armor, was insufficient to achieve reliable penetration. Your intelligence estimate of this tank's combat effectiveness appears to be substantially underestimated. Richter set down his pen and studied Klaus for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the window of the shed, and stared out at the forested landscape. "There are rumors coming down from Strategic Command," Richter said quietly, his back to Klaus. "Rumors that the Americans have plans for something even larger, something that might carry a 90mm gun or larger. German command is operating under the assumption that we will maintain our superiority until at least late 1945, when we expect to have sufficient numbers of Panther and Tiger tanks to regain the offensive initiative. But if what you are reporting is accurate, that assumption may be fundamentally flawed." He turned back to face Klaus. "I need you to understand something, Hauptsturmführer. In Germany, we have a saying, 'The facts do not care about our theories.' You have reported facts. Those facts contradict our current operational doctrines. That means our doctrines must change, or we must find new ways to defeat this enemy. What matters now is what we do with this knowledge." Over the next 3 weeks, Klaus participated in a series of interviews with German Armour Command, technical specialists, and combat theorists. Each conversation reinforced what he had discovered in that single, catastrophic engagement. The era of German armoured superiority was ending, not because German armour was becoming obsolete, but because the Americans were finally learning how to build tanks that could match German design philosophy. Klaus began to observe something fascinating during these meetings. The German Strategic Command, faced with evidence that contradicted their long-standing assumptions about armoured superiority, didn't react with flexibility. Instead, they reacted with denial, then compromise, then adaptation. Some officers argued that the jumbo was a fluke, an anomaly produced by American desperation. Some argued that new German armour, still in development, would regain superiority. Some argued that the tactics should change, more emphasis on anti-tank guns, less emphasis on tank versus tank engagement. But Klaus had lived through enough of the war to understand something that strategic planners sometimes missed. The war was no longer about individual engagements or even individual campaigns. The war was about production capacity, resource management, and the ability to sustain combat operations indefinitely. Germany could produce maybe 1 Tiger for every 3 Shermans the Americans could field. If American Shermans were becoming progressively better armed and armoured, that production ratio suddenly became catastrophic. Klaus also began to receive reports from other tank units, reports of Panthers being penetrated by 76mm guns, reports of Tigers being damaged by American anti-tank guns that should have been ineffective, reports of entire panzer companies being destroyed by American armour combinations that German intelligence had predicted could not happen. The jumbo wasn't a fluke. The jumbo was a harbinger. By late October 1944, Klaus had been reassigned from active combat command to a liaison position with German armour development. It was, on its surface, a promotion. It was, in reality, a sidelining. Klaus was being removed from command because he had become too vocal about the need for fundamental changes to German armour strategy, too vocal about the limitations of the Tiger, too vocal about the fact that the jumbo engagement had revealed structural flaws in German operational planning. But Klaus didn't resist this assignment. Instead, he threw himself into it with the intensity of a man who had been granted a second purpose after his first had been shattered. He spent weeks in technical discussions with German engineers, examining armour specifications, discussing gun performance, reviewing combat reports from tank crews across the entire front. What he discovered was both reassuring and terrifying. The German engineers understood the problem. They understood that armour needed to be thicker. They understood that guns needed to be more powerful. They understood that the days of relying more on superior doctrine and training were ending, and that future armoured warfare would be won by whoever could produce the best combination of armour, firepower, and mobility. But they were working within constraints that the Americans did not face: limited raw materials, disrupted supply chains, fuel shortages, and most critically, they were fighting a two-front war with dwindling resources. Klaus attended a meeting with Ferdinand Porsche, the legendary designer who had created the Tiger tank that Klaus now commanded. The meeting took place in Stuttgart, in a facility hidden beneath the city to protect it from Allied bombing. Klaus remembered Porsche as an old man now, worn down by the weight of knowing that his designs, revolutionary as they had been, were becoming obsolete. "The Jumbo," Porsche said to Klaus, studying technical drawings spread across a large table, "represents the ultimate expression of American armor philosophy. Thick, simple, reliable. We designed the Tiger to be superior through precision and doctrine. The Americans are building tanks to be superior through sheer mass and protection. Both approaches are valid. Both approaches can be beaten, but the American approach is easier to produce, easier to maintain, and easier to teach to mediocre crews. That is the problem we face." Klaus listened and absorbed, understanding that Porsche was describing not just a military problem, but the fundamental reality of industrial war. Germany could not compete with American production. Germany could not compete with Soviet manpower. Germany's only advantage had been superior training, superior tactics, and superior equipment. The Jumbo had negated the equipment advantage. Soviet attrition was negating the training advantage. Time was negating the tactical advantage. In November 1944, Klaus received orders that changed everything. He was to accompany a technical team to the front to examine a captured Jumbo that had been disabled during a battle near Aachen. German command wanted detailed measurements, armor samples if possible, and Klaus's assessment of combat implications. Klaus travelled with the technical team in a small convoy, moving cautiously through German-held territory that was becoming increasingly fragmented. The captured Jumbo sat in a concealed position near Aachen, guarded by German infantry, and examined by a rotating team of engineers. When Klaus first saw it, standing alone and disabled like a captured beast, it struck him with an unexpected force. This was not a monster anymore. This was evidence. This was data that could be studied, analysed, understood. The technical team began their work immediately, taking measurements, collecting armour samples, making sketches and notes. Klaus climbed onto the tank and examined it from every angle, his trained eye reading the armour configuration like a language he had learned to speak. What he discovered was both obvious and profound. The Americans had made no attempt at elegant design. The Jumbo's armour was simply thick uniformly, brutally thick. There were no sophisticated sloping angles, no complex calculations of ballistic geometry. Just steel. Lots of steel. It was a design philosophy born from abundance, not scarcity. An approach that could only work if you had unlimited resources and could accept the penalties of weight, speed, and fuel consumption. It was, Klaus realized, fundamentally un-German. German design was always about doing more with less. American design was about using more to accomplish the necessary. That evening, sitting in the officer's tent while the technical team prepared their reports, Klaus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Klaus wrote a letter that night, not an official report, not a technical document. A personal letter to his sister Elizabeth, who lived in Munich with her 3 children. Her husband had been killed in Russia in 1943. She had written Klaus several times asking him for his honest assessment of how the war was progressing. Klaus had always responded with carefully worded phrases that said nothing. Tonight, he decided to tell her the truth. "The war," he wrote, "is ending. Not next month or next year, but it is ending. We fought believing that superior German skill and training could overcome American production and resources. We were wrong. The Americans have learned from 3 years of combat. They have learned what we know. They are building tanks that can match ours. They are producing them in numbers that we cannot match. I do not know how much longer this war will last, but I know how it will end. What troubles me is not that we will lose, but what we will have become by the time we do. I have spent 3 years commanding men in tanks. I have given orders that resulted in enemy deaths. I have killed men I have never met. I have justified this killing by telling myself it was necessary, that it was duty, that it was for Germany. But sitting here, examining this American tank, I realized something that perhaps I should have understood earlier. The men inside that tank were fighting for the same reasons I was fighting. They were told they were defending something. They were told their cause was just, and now, despite all the superiority of German training and doctrine, those men are proving to be as capable as we are. When this war ends, and it will end, I want you to help me remember that the enemy was not evil. The enemy was human, and I, who have spent these years preparing to kill those humans, must find a way to live with that knowledge when the killing finally stops. Klaus did not mail the letter. Instead, he kept it in his tunic, the pages folded and refolded until they were soft as cloth. He would remove it sometimes, particularly in the dark hours before dawn, and read those words to remind himself of a truth he had discovered too late. That certainty was a luxury that war would take from you if you held on to it long. Enough. In December 1944, Klaus returned to active command. The German army was preparing for one final offensive, a desperate gamble in the Ardennes designed to split the American forces and force them to negotiate. Klaus was given command of a panzer company, once again not his old company, most of whom had been killed or captured or scattered across the Russian front, but a new company of fresh tigers and panthers, crewed by men who still believed that German armour could win battles. Klaus didn't tell them what he had learned. Instead, he trained them. He trained them in the tactics that had always worked. He trained them in the coordination and discipline that had always defined German armour superiority. But he also trained them in something new, the importance of surviving engagements, of not committing to battles they couldn't win, of knowing when to retreat. His men thought he had become cautious, perhaps even cowardly. But Klaus understood something they didn't. Bravery that resulted in death was just death with a different name. Survival was a form of courage too, perhaps the highest form. The Ardennes offensive began on December 16th. Klaus's company was held in reserve, and he watched from the command post as German armour poured forward in a desperate attempt to recapture the initiative. The intelligence reports came in slowly, filtered through layers of command, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes painting a picture of temporary success. But Klaus understood what was actually happening. The Americans were surprised, yes. The Americans were initially overwhelmed in some sectors, yes. But the Americans had air superiority. The Americans had reserves. The Americans had logistics that could sustain their defense indefinitely. And within days, the picture became clear. The German offensive was failing. It would continue to fail. It was, in essence, already lost. Klaus received orders to commit his company to a breakthrough attempt near a town, called Bastogne. He studied the maps and understood that this was a likely position where American armour would make a stand. He understood that his company would be ordered into an engagement with superior American forces in terrain that favoured the defender. He also understood that these were his last moments of actual military command. The night before the planned engagement, Klaus made a decision that would define his later life. He called his company commanders together in the darkness and made a statement that, had it been heard by the wrong people, could have resulted in his execution for cowardice or defeatism. Tomorrow, Klaus told them, we will be ordered to attack American positions near Bastogne. We will be told that a breakthrough is possible, that our armour superiority can achieve victory. We will be told that German tanks can defeat American armour and American defences. These things are no longer true, if they ever were. Tomorrow, we will do our duty as soldiers. But I want you to understand that our duty now is to survive. Our duty is to preserve the lives of our crews. Our duty is to understand that war has become a game where no one wins, and the only reasonable goal is to lose as little as possible. His company commanders stared at him in stunned silence. One of them, a young Hauptsturmführer named Werner, began to speak, but Klaus raised his hand. I am telling you this, Klaus continued, because I have come to understand that the certainty I carried into this war, the certainty that we were right, that German superiority was unquestionable and that victory was inevitable, was a luxury that the jumbo tank took from me. When I saw that American tank shrug off my 88mm rounds, I finally understood the true nature of war. It is not about being right, it is about being stronger, or being more numerous, or being luckier. We are not stronger anymore. We are not more numerous. Our luck has run out. The next day, Klaus led his company into the engagement near Bastogne. He fought with skill and professionalism. He maneuvered his tanks to maximum advantage. He achieved several kills against American armor, but he also implemented a strategy that German command would have called cowardly. He preserved his force by disengaging when the engagement became tactically unfavorable, by retreating when retreat made sense, by prioritizing survival over victory. His company lost 2 tanks destroyed. His previous company, under different command, would have lost all of them. The war lasted another 4 months after that engagement. Klaus participated in several more battles, each one progressively more desperate, each one progressively less likely to result in anything but German defeat. By April 1945, his company consisted of 2 functional tanks, 14 dead crew members, and Klaus's own Tiger, which bore the scars of half a dozen engagements. Klaus surrendered his company to American forces in May 1945. The war was over. Germany was defeated. Hitler was dead. Klaus survived the war with something that many of his fellow officers did not: his life, his mind intact, and a fundamental change in his understanding of certainty itself. In the years that followed, Klaus worked in various roles in occupied Germany. He helped American forces understand German armor doctrine. He worked as a translator. Eventually, he emigrated to Argentina, where he lived quietly for 3 decades, married, raised a family, and never spoke about the war unless directly asked. But the letter he had written that night near Aachen, the letter to his sister Elizabeth, he kept. And in his later years, when his children would ask him about the war, he would remove that letter and read it aloud. And he would tell them the truth that the jumbo tank had taught him. Certainty is the most dangerous thing a man can carry into battle. It blinds you to reality. It makes you vulnerable to opponents who understand that rigidity can be defeated by flexibility. It makes you believe that the world conforms to your expectations. The jumbo did not conform to my expectations, and that moment of contradiction, that moment when reality refused to match my certainty, became the moment when I finally began to see the war as it truly was. Not a struggle between good and evil, but a catastrophe that consumed millions of people who were, on both sides, simply doing what they had been told was their duty. Klaus Bergmann died in Buenos Aires in 1982. He was 87 years old. His obituary, printed in a small German-language newspaper in Argentina, mentioned that he had been a German officer in the Second World War, and that he had spent his final years working as a consultant on armor history and design. What the obituary did not mention was that Klaus Bergmann had learned something that many soldiers never learned, that the moment when certainty shatters can be the moment when understanding begins. That an enemy tank, properly studied and properly analyzed, can teach more lessons than 1,000 hours of training, and that the journey from unquestioning belief to hard-won wisdom is sometimes marked by a 76mm round punching through your armor and changing everything you thought you knew about the world. The M4A3E2 Jumbo never became the tank that saved the American war effort. Fewer than 250 were ever produced. They were used in various campaigns, but never in concentrations large enough to dominate the battlefield in the way the Tiger or Panther could dominate in favorable circumstances. But for Klaus Bergmann, and for every German tanker who faced one, the Jumbo became something more important than a mere vehicle. It became proof that even the most deeply held certainties can be shattered by reality, and that the men willing to shatter those certainties might be not villains or inferiors, but simply better adapted to the changing nature of war. In the end, it was not the 88mm gun or the sloped armor or the superior German training that mattered. What mattered was a simple fact that Klaus finally understood. The Americans had learned faster than the Germans, and in a war defined by industrial capacity and the ability to adapt to new realities, learning faster might be the only advantage that ultimately mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.